Hi, welcome to Paul Programs. Today, we're talking about the grid. The grid is the digital frontier that... Wait, no, that's not the grid we're talking about. Today, we're actually going to be talking about how grids are used in games as gameplay. First, we're going to look at some physical games that have made use of grids. Then, we'll take a look at some digital games that use grids. And lastly, we'll jump into Unity and see how we can build a game using a grid. Grids have been used in physical games for a long time. Some examples of games that have made use of grids are chess, checkers, and Go. Grids allow an opportunity for players to strategize against their opponents. First, we're going to take a look at chess, which is one of the most classic games combining strategy and grids. In chess, two players are given several pieces placed on opposite sides of a grid. The goal is to trap the king. This involves using other pieces that move in different ways across the board. The most important concept in chess is positioning and strategy. Each player is trying to position their pieces in a way so they can get their opponent's king. Another great example of a physical game using grids is the tabletop game HeroClix. In the game, players choose pieces that represent their different superheroes like Captain America, Iron Man, Batman, Superman, etc. In the game, the players play on a map that's a grid. On this grid, there are different squares that represent different things. Some squares may represent walls, others may represent hidden terrain, and then some squares even represent different elevation. The point is for players to beat their opponent's team. In order to do so, they'll have to strategize and make use of the different grid squares and terrain. This will allow them to come up with better plans and teams and so on and so forth in order to approach and win the game. That covers our look at physical games using grids. Now, let's take a look at some digital games. So, when talking about digital games using grids, most people usually think about tactical RPGs, and the best example of that is Final Fantasy Tactics. In the game, the player controls a party of all sorts of characters that can have different jobs and abilities. Your goal is basically to navigate around a grid of different elevations, terrain, so on and so forth, to defeat any opponents or monsters that may be on the field. This requires using strategy, elevation, taking advantage of abilities that may allow you to traverse grids that you normally wouldn't be able to, and so on and so forth. But basically, in strategy RPGs, the grid is the most important part because that's how the players traverse around. Another great example of how grids can be used in games is the new game, One Step from Eden. In the game, similar to the Mega Man Battle Network games, you have the player and then their opponents split onto two sides of a grid. Neither of them can cross the middle. You also have the abilities to affect certain grid squares or a certain amount of grid squares. So you're always moving around while avoiding enemies' attacks, while trying to strategize the best way you can attack the different squares that your opponent is on or can move toward. This is another unique way of taking advantage of grids. Alright. That covers our look at the different types of games that make use of grids. Now, let's jump into Unity and see how we can actually make our own game using a grid. Alright, here we have our Unity project. As you can see, we have a bunch of cubes set up in a grid pattern. And if we move over to the right and look at our hierarchy, you can see we have each of the different cube objects labeled. It's labeled to represent the x-axis and the y-axis on the grid. So say we choose this one right here, it's labeled to represent an x-axis of 2 and a y-axis of 0. Remember, coders always start counting at 0. So, now that we've seen what our setup looks like, let's take a look at the actual game. Okay, here we have our game. So, this is just the title screen, so we're gonna kind of rush past that. And now we have our actual game. As you can see, we have our controls, which are WASD, the usual up, down, left, right. And as you notice, when you push a button, so if we push up, the player moves up on the grid. If we push down, the player moves down on the grid. If we push right, they move right on the grid. And if we push left, they move left on the grid. So you can see the movement's pretty simple, but they stay within the grid as expected. That pretty much covers the basics of the gameplay of this. It's not a very complicated game, but it's a good way of showing how grids actually work. Now that we've taken a look at how the game actually plays and how the player moves along the grid, let's take a look at the code that makes all the magic happen. Alright, here we have our code. The most important piece of code we're going to take a look at is the player movement script. This is the one that handles all the movement across the grid. So let's actually move down to our update method. So here in our update method, you can see we're checking for user input. Depending on which key the player presses, it'll decide what position on the grid to move the player. What it does is it sets the player's position on the X or Y because we use a vector 2 to track where on the grid the player is located. The next thing is that it's going to actually move the player and call the move player method. Alright, once we get the player input, we're going to want to move over to our move player method. Our move player method is going to actually take the vector 2 value that we created based on the input, and then it's going to compare it and look to see if there's an actual cube with the same name. So you can see right here, we set the X value, and then we set the Y value. Next, we're going to actually do a transform find to see if we can actually find that panel. If we do, then the players actually move to that panel, and it's pretty much given the same coordinates on the X and Z planes because we're working in 3D space as the cube that it's supposed to be over. Once that's done, then it'll play the sound as well. Otherwise, it's going to put out a message saying that it couldn't find the panel, most likely because the player's either at an edge point or the panel doesn't exist for some reason or other. That pretty much covers the gist of moving the player on the grid. If you want, we can also take a quick look at these other two methods. One is get player position. This allows any other method or other script to call this method and find out where the player is located. The other is reset player, which would reset the player back to its default position of 0, 0 on the grid that's created. And that pretty much covers everything we need to know about the scripts that are actually making the magic happen. And with that, that covers our look at grids and how they're used in games. Hopefully you learned a little bit and will be interested in making your own grid game. Who knows, you may even make the next Final Fantasy Tactics. You can find the code for the simple grid game that's built below. Also, if you have any thoughts, comments, or questions, leave those below as well. Thanks for watching, and send my regards to Kevin Flynn.